You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. Last Tuesday, I sat down with Ely Ratner. Dr. Ratner is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. It's a big part of the world. We got to as many topics as we could in the time that we were allotted. We unfortunately didn't get to talk much about AUKUS or India, two massive topics. Hopefully Ely will come back on the show and we'll chat more about those things. But I do think you're going to enjoy this conversation quite a lot. So how does one become a senior defense official?
You know, everyone's got their own path, and I get asked all the time from folks who are up and coming in the field, you know, if they aspire to a certain position in government, how should they go about it? And my answer is, you know, everyone's got their own way. For me, it was to be trying a variety of things. As my mom always said, try to have as many arrows in your quiver as you can. And for me, that was doing jobs in Washington, going to grad school out in California, living in China, studying lots of different things. For other people, it is move to Washington, get an internship, hitch yourself to a senior person and climb the ladder straight up. I think there's a lot of different ways to go.
Where were you doing your graduate work?
So I did my PhD out at UC Berkeley and took some time off while I was at Berkeley. Back here in Washington, did a stint on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So I was in Washington for about a year and a half while I was doing my PhD program, put that on pause, and then spent a considerable amount of time in the latter part of my PhD out in China, in Shanghai, and living in Beijing as well.
About what year was that you were in China?
I was there in 2007, 2008. So it was a really interesting time to be there because it was obviously in the lead up to the Summer Olympics in Beijing, which the government considered really as their coming out party as a great power. And it was absolutely fascinating time to be in Beijing, but also to be traveling around the country, and saw some really interesting things while I was there. If we have a moment on this, I can share a story. Shaped my view about this. One of the things I decided while I was in China was, rather than traveling all around the region, what I should do is travel around China and see parts of China that one would not see otherwise. One would not probably make an independent trip from the United States to go to. And I learned a lot through that. It's a beautiful country. It's a lot like the United States, very diverse in terms of the people and the culture and the geography. One of the trips I made out was to Xinjiang, out to Western China, best known now for the genocide that the Chinese government has committed there against the Uyghurs. And this was, again, 2008, and they had just started to intensify some of the crackdown there. And so the time that I was out there, coincidentally, was when the Olympic torch was being run through Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. And so there had been a lot of controversy around this Olympic torch running, if you remember, because there were protests in Europe, people disrupting the running of the Olympic torch. And they were obviously concerned about security issues throughout China. So we landed in Xinjiang. We got picked up by the tour guide. Again, beautiful part of the country, deserts. We ended up traveling eventually out to the border with Pakistan there. But we got into Urumqi and they said, listen, the Olympic torch is coming through, so we're going to impose martial law, and you guys have a choice. You can either stay here inside the city, or you can leave. But if you leave, you're not going to be allowed back in.
And you were told this as essentially a student or a tourist visiting researcher.
Yeah, exactly. So, of course, we're going to stay, right? Like, we got to see this. And it was really remarkable. They ended up, number one, lining the streets, and this is a vast area, right? This is desert area, lining the streets with PRC security officials felt like almost 10 feet for miles and miles and miles and miles. And it was really an expression of the power of the police state that they were starting to put in place. They shuttered all of the shops. They literally locked the local population inside their communities. You could see people looking out the gates of their communities, and they bust in hundreds of Han Chinese to line the streets and wave flags as the torch was run through. So we were there to see all that. And then, of course, returned to Beijing for the Olympics themselves, which was another just absolute expression of Chinese power and the power of the state, and sort of this moment of confidence and control. And I have to say, when I got back to the United States after that period, it was clear to me that we were facing a much more assertive and confident China than I think Washington knew at the time. So it was very formative in terms of my thinking about this challenge.
I remember it was around the same time. It might have been a year or two before that. I was talking with a friend of mine who worked on the Hill at the time, and he had been over there on a congressional delegation. And at the time, China was showing off kind of what they were doing to the Uyghurs as a case study in de-radicalization, because we're in the middle of the war on terror at the time, and they were trying to sell that, as a lot of authoritarian regimes were sort of using the war on terror frame for their own domestic crackdowns. China was saying, no, like, this is good, they're extremists, and selling this to an American audience. Eventually, not successfully, but I do think that too many people fell for that in the US for a while. A lot of conversations about this part of the world start with China. I would like to spend a bit of time talking about North Korea, which is starting to get a little more renewed attention. Some people recently came out and said that North Korea is in a pre-war mode, basically. What's your view of how North Korea sees its neighborhood and the time that it's in, and its rivalry, I guess you could say, with the United States and South Korea? And how has that changed over the course of the last couple of years?
The first thing I'll say is we have to have a little bit of humility about how we understand North Korea's intentions. That said, we do see them obviously modernizing their missile and nuclear capabilities in a way that is of serious concern, that's in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and presents new challenges to our allies in the region and the United States. I would say for our part, at least my current assessment is not that they are on an intentional march to major war. And what we have to be focused on is a couple things. One is strengthening our readiness and strengthening deterrence and continuing to build our alliance with the South Koreans, and then strengthen the trilateral relationship between the United States, Japan, and Korea. And I think that's something we've done, and we can talk a little bit more detail about what that has looked like in particular, but trying to get away from thinking about our activities in Northeast Asia as simply a response to North Korean behavior and actions, and building readiness and deterrence on our own timetable in the way that we believe is necessary. And I think we have absolutely been doing that. And the rebuilding of the certain habits of cooperation and exercises and operations with South Korea has been really important. We've advanced our dialogues around strategic issues. We've had increased deployment of strategic assets. We've renewed major exercises with South Korea, and again in the trilateral context as well. So I think strengthening that deterrence and that readiness is the most important thing we can do. But it is concerning, and certainly North Korea's relationship with Russia is something we're watching very closely, which is having impacts not only on Russia's ability to continue to wage its war against Ukraine, but also the potential for Russia to strengthen North Korea's capabilities over time. The last thing I'll say here, Ryan, is that I did say at least my assessment is not that North Korea is on a march toward major power war. That doesn't mean that we should be complacent, because we see them engaging in gray zone activity, and there is always the potential for miscalculation and certain types of lower level actions to spiral into crisis and conflict, and we have to ward against that at the same time.
As you alluded to earlier, it's a notoriously difficult regime to understand. They don't seem particularly interested in talking, though. That seems clear.
Well, we have been saying since the beginning of the Biden administration that we are open to dialogue, and we continue to have that position. And you're right, we're not currently engaged in diplomacy around this issue.
It does seem that one of the big good news stories of the last few years that you alluded to is the sort of growing reconciliation, warmth, and cooperation between South Korea and Japan. You know, for listeners who are less familiar with that, a lot of the difficulty there was rooted in their respective experiences in World War II, with Japan being the oppressor and sort of, in South Korea's eyes, especially refusing to come to terms with some of the horrible things that they did during the war. What allowed South Korea and Japan to move past that, and what was Washington's role in helping to facilitate that?
Yeah, well, I think you're right to identify this as truly a historic transformation over the last couple of years in terms of the relationship between Japan and the Republic of Korea, and then the trilateral cooperation on the defense side that has resulted from that. In terms of what has facilitated it, the most immediate answer to that is to just remarkable leadership in both Tokyo and Seoul, and stepping forward and being willing to, again, reach out a hand to their partners and try to get over some of those historical questions. So that's really where this has started. And then there has been an absolute commitment on the part of the United States to advance this as well. And, if you look at the people on the U.S. side who have been involved in this, they've been involved in this in a long time. Secretary Blinken during the Obama administration was the point person for trilateral cooperation. So he was very involved in this toward the end of the Obama administration. When President Biden was vice president, he convened a number of trilateral engagements. And then you have folks like Kirk Campbell who have spent their entire career on this. So this was not a new issue.
And you probably worked on it a bit as well during the Obama administration when you were Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden and also in the Pentagon earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I remember quite clearly toward the end of the Obama administration was a trilateral engagement that Vice President Biden led with the Koreans and the Japanese during his Cancer Moonshot initiative, bringing together healthcare professionals and scientists from all three countries, which I think is demonstrative of what can really be achieved between three advanced democracies. And I'll just say on the defense front, it has been really remarkable over the last 6 months, in particular since the Camp David summit that President Biden led. Again, a really historic moment, bringing together the leadership and setting forward a couple of very specific initiatives for our defense establishments to work on that we actually completed by the end of 2023. One, sharing early warning missile data, which is really important for our own ability to cooperate in terms of identifying and responding to potential missile threats, and something that countries hold pretty dear in terms of sharing what they know about what's happening in their region, what they know about each other, what they're revealing about their own capabilities. So that's been quite important. And I think most significantly, our three countries agreed on a multi-year exercise plan, which was something that was set forth. Again, the trilateral military cooperation historically has been relatively episodic or in response to a North Korean activity. So the North Koreans test an ICBM, there's a trilateral air or maritime activity. What we have set out to do, and we now have agreed on a plan to do it, is to have a regularized pace of trilateral exercises that is, of course, reinforcing that deterrence, but not just responsive. We're doing it on our own terms, on our own schedule, and I think that will be a growing feature of the regional security architecture, will be the increasing of, including in some instances, potentially major marquee trilateral exercises between Japan and South Korea. So really, really important. And maybe just the last thing I'll say, as we think about, and lots to say about the U.S.-Japan relationship, but as we think about the relationship with South Korea, we have been, again, deepening our bilateral alliance. We've been strengthening dialogue and communications and site visits around strategic issues and nuclear issues, expanding the trilateral piece. I think one other very notable element here is that President Yoon has talked about, and the South Koreans have put out their own Indo-Pacific strategy with an ambition for South Korea to be playing a larger role in the region, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. And that's something we believe creates a number of really important cooperative opportunities that go beyond just the focus on Northeast Asia. So that's an element that I think is very new, innovative, exciting, and strategically significant over time.
Japan has also announced some major increases in its defense investments. Are you content with where those levels are? Or do you think they need to be spending even more?
I think we strongly support their direction, and they've committed to doubling their defense budget, which is a very ambitious target, and they're on track to do that. They're also, as they're doing that, taking on more advanced roles and missions in the region. So again, having a broader conception of what their role is in the alliance and what their role is in the region. And they're, as you know, have been making decisions to acquire new capabilities. This past year, they announced they're going to be acquiring counter-strike capabilities, and that's something we are supporting them on. So again, I think this is all for the good. Japan is a leader in the region in a number of respects, and this is really important for them to be playing, I think, a more significant role in regional security.
We're coming up on the second anniversary of the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, which you played a hand in writing, I'm sure. Are you content with where we are by the benchmarks of the strategy? All I'm able to see, of course, is the public strategy. I know there's a classified strategy that's much longer that I'm not able to see, but are you happy with where we are? What more needs to be done to realize the full potential of the strategy?
Well, am I content? Ryan, I'm never content. And I think as we think about the our approach to the Indo-Pacific, our response to the China challenge, our efforts to try to strengthen our alliances and partnerships, we need to be continuing forward with heightened urgency, heightened resources, heightened attention. And that's been the path that we've been on. I think we've made some considerable gains. I think if you walk through particularly the defense elements of the strategy, you will see true implementation and materialization of some of the benchmarks that we put forward. One of them was on the US-Japan ROK trilateral relationship. We had ambitions around force posture, which we can get into in more detail, which we are on the path to realizing. We had ambitions about strengthening our relationship with India, which we have done. And we had ambitions around the ways in which we were going to bring the region together in new constellations, the Quad, AUKUS, and other formations that I think are underway as well. And we ought to talk about each of those because they're new, they're exciting, and they're significant.
Let's definitely dig into posture first because, we've known each other a long time. You know that one of my longstanding concerns is that we just historically have not invested nearly enough in particularly maritime capabilities and capacity, and that it's been especially acute over the last 20 or so years. Talk about how the department's trying to change this.
Well, maybe the first thing I'll say is that what's been interesting over the last couple of years is that you're a scholar and an editor and someone who reads a lot and writes a lot. I came from an academic background. I've spent time at think tanks. You can see an evolution of policy ideas and policy development from going back 10, even more, 15 years that I believe over the last couple of years, again, have started to manifest themselves in ways that folks have been writing and talking about for a long time. And force posture is one of those where, you go back to the first term of the Obama administration, right? And there was a burst of activity there with the LCS in Singapore, the Marines in Darwin, some other steps we were taking at the time to try to bring about a more distributed, mobile, resilient force posture in the region away from traditionally our very Northeast Asia major operating base heavy force posture, which was very useful and appropriate under certain contexts, but within the context of China's military modernization, it designing its own military in part to try to find vulnerabilities in U.S. defense strategy, that kind of concentrated geographically and physically is exactly what China was trying to undermine with its area denial types of capabilities and strategies. So again, you go back 15 years and you have people writing, hey, look, we need a more distributed force posture. We've got to be more mobile. We've got to be more resilient. And coming into this term, you saw it in the Indo-Pacific strategy. You saw it in at least the work that we have done in our office in the Pentagon as we've thought about our priorities is, look, we gotta get after this. And what we have seen over the last couple of years, and particularly in 2023, was the coming together of one after another of agreements and arrangements with allies and partners in the region, really any one of which would have been historic, but happened in succession, one after another. I was at AEI in the winter of 2022 doing an event with Dasdy Chase and friends of the Mike Chase and friends of the show, Zach Cooper and Mackenzie Eaglin, and we were having a conversation about what was coming up in 2023. And I made a remark that there was an opportunity for 2023 to be the most transformative year in U.S. force posture, U.S. regional force posture in a generation. And both Mackenzie and Zach looked at me. Are you sure? You just said that, by the way, to a whole room full of people with a bunch of journalists in the room. Are you sure you want to stand by that? And I said, let's see. And subsequent to that meeting, we had a round of the Osmond talks. These are 2+2 Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense talks we did with Australia. We've done another one since. And our force posture conversation with Australia has really advanced over the last couple of years from when, again, you go back and it was a major development for the U.S. military to talk about rotating 2,500 Marines out of Darwin. Of course, that's still very important, but the breadth of activities that we're talking about now across all domains, logistics, we've obviously got an AUKUS piece associated with that in Western Australia. And so started in motion a much more comprehensive, holistic conversation about our force posture in Australia, which is really important in terms of logistics, flowing forces in, and force projection into the region. We then had a major set of discussions with Japan where we announced some revisions to not to increase the number of forces we had in Japan, but to change the composition, to introduce by 2025, next year now, a Marine Littoral Regiment, which is the Marine's most advanced fighting formation. We agreed to bring in additional Army watercraft, which is really important to move forces around Japan's islands to be more mobile, including Japanese forces. We agreed to do more exercises with Japan's self-defense forces in the Southwest Islands. Very important geography if you look at the map, and we've started doing that. So you think about the Japan piece of this.
Some people, I remember, just to interrupt you, saying,
yeah,
especially some of the stuff that I think the Marines might have with them there, things that naysayers were saying Japan would never allow U.S. forces to bring. So things like missiles, potentially, things that might not have been allowed during the under the INF treaty, but now that that treaty is part of history, a lot of people, when we pulled out of that, said, well, we're never going to be able to use these things in the Indo-Pacific anyway. And it seems like they're steadily being proven wrong.
That's been the story, frankly, of the last couple of years of, whether it's India or Australia or the Philippines or South Korea or Japan, we are doing things with our partners that naysayers or skeptics or people just burdened by history saying that's never going to happen. And I think Japan is undergoing a transformation in its strategic orientation that is opening up those kinds of opportunities. But just to finish the posture story, we engaged in a serious set of discussions with the Philippines as well, where they agreed to allow 4 additional EDCA sites. These are Philippine locations where U.S. forces are allowed access in strategic locations, building upon earlier agreements, 3 in northern Philippines, 1 out on the edges of the South China Sea. And then in terms of the sort of other big element of this, we signed a new defense cooperation agreement with Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia, which will allow access opportunities for the United States. I had the opportunity to travel with Secretary Austin to Papua New Guinea last year, first visit ever by a U.S. Secretary of Defense. And that will be also an area where we are already doing site surveys and thinking about investments in port and airfields there. So really, it's worth, I love maps. I think they tell you a lot about international politics. It's worth pulling out a map and looking at a line down from Japan through the Southwest Islands, through the Philippines, down through Papua New Guinea, down through Australia. And what we are talking about here, in my perspective, is the fortification of the U.S. defense perimeter in the Western Pacific. Now, these things take time. These are agreements. Agreements have to your point of we need more and we need faster. I agree with that. And the implementation and execution of these is the task ahead. But we now have the political military agreements in place to start moving forward on this. And I think it is profoundly important. And we can talk about this a little bit, sort of the why as it relates to how we think about deterrence and how we think about maintaining peace and stability in the region. But we are now on a course, back to sort of the Indo-Pacific strategy, back to your question of posture, we're now on a course to have that more distributed, lethal, mobile, resilient force posture that folks have been aspiring toward for decades.
How confident are you that the resourcing is going to be there to take full advantage of the potential that's been opened up by all these agreements and new arrangements that we have in the Indo-Pacific? So in terms of more ships, deeper magazine depths, and we could talk about how Ukraine and other demands fit into this later on, but it seems like the missing dimension here is resourcing.
That is going to be a challenge. Look, 2022 National Defense Strategy put forward the PRC as the department's top pacing challenge. Okay, even in the wake of the initial invasion of Ukraine, department went forward with that, and you will hear department leaders continue to say the PRC remains the pacing challenge. So obviously, there are major crises elsewhere in the world right now. Obviously, those draw attention and resources, but the NDS has remained the pillar inside the department around resourcing questions. The 2024 budget was the most strategy-driven budget in the department's history. And even as the gravitational pull of some of those other crises is occurring, you do have department leaders in the services, in budget processes saying we have to keep our eye on the Indo-Pacific. So that will be an ongoing challenge. It has been for a long time in terms of how you balance certain types of challenges versus the immediate crises of the day. But I would say on balance, what I've seen is substantial commitment to that prioritization, and some of what has been revealed through crises in Ukraine and elsewhere associated with our capacity, our defense industrial base, has created a lot of energy around ensuring that we shore up the defense industrial base so we have that capacity in the future and in the near term. And that's in part because of the China challenge. So I think there has been a broad recognition that, for instance, the strengthening of the defense industrial base has to be a huge priority. That's a significant portion of the national security supplemental that's potentially working its way through Congress right now in terms of investing in the submarine industrial base, investing in the munitions industrial base. And that's one of the reasons why, when I look at the national security supplemental through a lens of the Indo-Pacific, there is the degree to which our ability to support these conflicts in other places and support our allies and partners are really important. There's a degree to which there is, no kidding, foreign military financing for the Indo-Pacific, which is important. But there's also this third piece of support for the defense industrial base that over time will bear significant fruit for the Indo-Pacific.
So as you know, there's certain voices in the Republican Party who are very vocal about Ukraine is coming at the cost of our being ready to defend Taiwan if the balloon goes up there. I'm going to ask the question in a different way, because I'm pretty sure where you come down is you would say that's not true. But let me ask the question in a different way. Because of what you said about the political will that it's created to take much more ambitious steps with our industrial base, although there's a lot more to do there, and because of that conversation that it's animated, do you think we are better prepared today to defend Taiwan than we would have been had Ukraine never happened? So this is really about the question of the resources and attention that have had to go to Ukraine and the fight over Ukraine versus the political will and policy moves that have been made in response to what that's revealed about our industrial base and magazine depth capacity, things like that.
Yeah, I think we've learned a lot. And let me answer your question, but not just by giving you my view, which again, you may anticipate. But I think one thing that it's important for folks to look at when they ask this question of, does Ukraine matter and in what way for the Indo-Pacific, is how are countries and leaders in the Indo-Pacific responding to that crisis? And what we have seen is, number one, Tsai Ing-wen on Taiwan saying what happens in Ukraine is really important for Taiwan. So we ought to take her word for it. We've seen leaders in South Korea, in Japan, in Singapore, in Australia voicing diplomatic support for Ukraine, providing humanitarian assistance, certain instances providing material assistance. So they see that what happens in Ukraine is mattering for the Indo-Pacific. So we can have our debates inside here, inside the Beltway, about how much does this really matter. I think the region is speaking with their feet about whether they think what's happening in Ukraine is strategically significant in terms of China's own calculations. So I think that's an important barometer in my view. To your question, are we better off? I think I would say there are, a couple elements here that are, again, significant as we think about deterrence and our approach to the region. Number one, as you mentioned, is a realization and the need to revitalize the defense industrial base. I think that's important. That is occurring. We obviously have more work to do with Congress to ensure we get the national security supplemental through, as well as the budget processes and the annual appropriations that are trying to get after this problem. We have also seen on the battlefield in Ukraine the ways in which smaller powers can tie down larger militaries through asymmetric capabilities and other means. And I think that's been important for deterrence, for less capable militaries to understand the kinds of investments they can make and the way to think about deterrence. And then, of course, the construction of a coalition to deal with this issue is significant for the Indo-Pacific as well. insofar as it's always a good thing for deterrence for autocrats to see the advanced democratic world coming together and working together militarily, economically, diplomatically to try to sustain a more free and open order. So I think all of those are important. And the department has a very detailed effort underway to understand the lessons from Ukraine from an operational perspective. And I think that's really important too, because there are elements of the conflict in Ukraine, and I'm not going to get into this any detail here, but there are elements of the conflict that are pertinent to potential conflicts in the Indo-Pacific, but also relevant to new forms of warfighting that we're seeing emerging out of there. So I think there's a lot of diplomatic, military, and strategic lessons that do bear and that are informing our approach to the Indo-Pacific.
What's your view of the pace of Chinese military modernization, and also in the context of Xi's recent purging termination of senior ELA leaders?
Two great questions with somewhat different answers. I won't say contradictory, but somewhat different answers. So on the first, the PLA continues a very aggressive military modernization program, and we've cataloged that in our China Military Power Report, which is our annual report to Congress describing China's strategy and our best understanding, as well as their military modernization. It's an unclassified report and would urge folks who are interested in what I think is the premier product on the PLA to look that up. And it documents across all domains a very rapid, aggressive military modernization program across all domains: nuclear, space, cyber, obviously maritime, air, land, etc. So that is significant. And, they're not 10 feet tall. There are questions around their ability to actually operate in a joint fashion. There's questions around...
And at scale.
And at scale. And, they don't have the warfighting experience of other countries. So that's all real. But in terms of hardware, and we do see them in terms of their exercises and operations becoming more complex, operating further from China's shores. So that is all absolutely happening. The corruption issue is interesting insofar as what we have seen over the last months, year, has been a little different than how we have understood corruption in the PLA over time, because we've known, it's a very corrupt organization, as is the Chinese Communist Party. There's a lot of graft. There's a lot of money sloshing around in a very opaque system. A lot of people lining their pockets. And when Xi Jinping first went after corruption earlier on in his term 10 years ago, it was very much about sort of bringing order and discipline back to the Communist Party. So, down with the big banquets, down with the really expensive baijiu, back to the, principles of the Communist Party. And that was thought to have had some effect, again, on sort of party discipline and these traditional forms of corruption, people buying their way into new jobs and whatnot. Some of the reporting that we have seen over the last year, and if you look at the particulars of the individuals and their organizations that have been rolled up in some of this corruption campaign, has been focused not only on this traditional question of graft, but also the degree to which it is having a material effect on their modernization program. So the corruption revealing itself not only because some general has a really fat bank account in Switzerland, but rather because a specific capability isn't working. And the money that has been siphoned off has resulted in detrimental effects to their capability. And so we've seen, for instance, the purging of military leadership across the rocket forces. We've seen purging throughout their defense industrial complex and some of their defense contractors. So that's quite significant. And I think it should give China's leadership pause about how deep and how systemic that corruption runs, and to what degree this very advanced military is going to work when they need it. And frankly, are they ready? And that's the fundamental question, is will they succeed if they were to choose to employ aggression? And as long as their answer to that is no or maybe not, then I think we're going to be able to reinforce deterrence. So I think this question of corruption is significant, not only because it shows sort of systemic rot, but also because it does factor into PLA and PRC leadership calculations about the actual capabilities of the PLA. But none of that suggests that we ought to be complacent about what we're seeing about very rapid military modernization.
Talk about Taiwan's military capabilities. And I'm sure you saw it, but I thought the CFR produced a great report with great visual elements about why exactly it's so hard to invade Taiwan and other things. But one of the things that I've been disappointed by, and I think other people have too, is Taiwan's, I would call, maybe you would characterize it differently, but unserious level of defense spending. And they had this big debate last year where they extended the term that conscripted soldiers have to serve, where it was, I forget what the exact time period, but it was too short before, and they raised it to something that's also too short, but is longer. Do you think now that with the election behind Taipei and the DPP, they will start getting more aggressive on defense reform and defense spending? Or, what's your interpretation of where that's heading? Do you think it's fair for Americans to expect Taiwan to spend more on defense?
Well, I guess I would have a slightly different characterization, Ryan, than you. I think over the last several years, and particularly under the leadership of Tsai Ing-wen, there has been a transformation in thinking and urgency in Taiwan in terms of the ways in which they're thinking about reforming their military and the capabilities associated with that. So, and we have seen major increases in their defense budget. It's now upwards of 2.5% of GDP. We can argue about whether or not that's enough, but it's certainly more than many U.S. allies and partners, and it's been increasing.
Yes.
It's been increasing by double digits. So I think there has been significant evolution and transformation.
I think the so-called Davidson window that Admiral Davidson said, this is when I think China's basically going to be ready to attack Taiwan, has been more of a distraction, not a very constructive contribution to our debate over how China's thinking about moving against Taiwan, if it ever does. And I think that that's become a more interesting debate more recently. I think people also get too overly fixed when she said, I want the PLA to be ready by this date. Chinese leaders have been saying that for a long time, and then they always feel they're still not ready. What's your view on deterrence and how China thinks about the timing of such a contingency, and how we can, and our allies are what's the state of administration thinking about deterrence in that context?
Yeah, so it's such an important question, and you've likely heard administration officials say, Secretary Austin on down, that we believe that an invasion of Taiwan is neither imminent nor inevitable. And those are really important foundational reflections of the current assessment, which is that Beijing's decision-making around the use of force against Taiwan remains conditional. And the central conditionality there is that, in terms of our understanding, is that they would have to be able to execute that operation at acceptable cost, right? Just classic deterrence theory. And, we continue to see China situating the Taiwan question in a broader conception of China's development and China's rise, and do not see Xi Jinping willing to put at risk all of his aspirations for China and China's development and China's role in the world to settle the Taiwan question. So what you hear department leaders saying, Deputy Secretary Hicks has said this, interestingly, Mike Gallagher has said this in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, that we want, when Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning, for him to look out the window, consider the cost of conflict, and say to himself, today is not the day, because we're not ready to do this in a way that we're confident that we could execute it in a short, sharp, low-cost way at acceptable cost. And so what we have to be doing to maintain peace and stability in the region is to ensure that even as that military modernization continues that we were just talking about, that the United States continues to introduce operational challenges and problems for China's military in a way that makes it increasingly, not decreasingly, difficult for him to solve. And so I think what you have seen over the last several years are a number of pieces associated with deterrence. Number one, combat credible deterrence and the capabilities we're investing in. Of course, we had the largest R&D investment ever, the largest procurement budget ever in last year's defense budget. So there is a building of U.S. capability there, but there's also the force posture piece, because the more forces we have that are distributed and mobile and forward, the harder it is for the PLA to be able to exact, again, that short, sharp low-cost invasion. We are also developing new operational concepts that make it much more difficult for China to succeed with the type of capability and strategy it has been building, certainly to the extent that it's been building its forces against an old American way of war. And we're working with allies and partners in the region as well to present a broader set of challenges for China. So it has to consider, if it starts a war against the United States, might that metastasize into a broader regional war against other allies and partners? So the way that I think about this problem in part is that as Beijing is trying to solve this puzzle in front of it, and sometimes people fixate on that part of it, that they've developed this capability or they've developed that capability, that we continue to put new challenges and operational dilemmas in front of them. And I think if we can do that over time, then we can maintain peace and stability. So I'll tell you, I was in a hearing last year with at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee testifying alongside Wendy Sherman, terrific Deputy Secretary of State. Marco Rubio had literally 10 seconds left in his questioning period. You know, they're counting down from their 5 minutes. And he asked me, he said, I have, 10 seconds left. Yes or no? Can we get through the end of the decade without a PRC invasion of Taiwan? And my answer was yes. And then I was about to go into a long answer to that. And he said, okay, my time has expired. And it was on to the next question. But the reason I say that is because there is a yes and part of that answer, which is yes. And it is imperative that we continue to invest in our own capabilities, invest in our posture, strengthen our alliances and partnerships. And I think if we do that over time, we can stay ahead of that deterrence curve. So I think that's where we are today. And we just have to keep working hard to maintain that. And if we do that, then there is no pin in the calendar at which somehow we magically flip. Now, the last thing I will say about this is part of the art here is we have to ensure that the ways in which we go about strengthening deterrence don't pull that time period forward. Because if we engage if we engage in activities that lead the PRC to conclude that it has no choice but to initiate conflict, then we could bring that day forward. But if we get that balance right, then I think we can sustain deterrence into the future.
That's all sounds very sensible, and I agree with pretty much all of that. The thing I worry about is leaders historically have not been great about judging when things will actually be as short and sharp as they. So even if we do all we can to make sure that she looks out the window and says, "Oh, today's not the day," you look back at World War I, World War II, Iran-Iraq War, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea's invasion of South Korea. These are all things where they thought it was going to be short and sharp, and it ended up going on for years. And I think that would, of course, be the biggest disaster, is a war that goes on for years over Taiwan or another patch of the Indo-Pacific somewhere. Because that then, our sophisticated operational concepts will help us less, and it'll really be more about endurance, as we're seeing right now with Ukraine. The ability to sustain manpower, materiel, political will, financial wherewithal, et cetera, et cetera. It's a tough problem to solve and to be prepared for.
It is a very tough problem to solve. I will tell you, one of the other, we were talking earlier about Ukraine, one of the other insights from Ukraine is the degree to which, exactly to your point, intentions for short conflicts can lead to very protracted conflict. And you cited some of the challenges associated with that. It's certainly a huge challenge for the PRC as well. And so we see them thinking about ways to insulate themselves from some of the challenge and vulnerabilities associated with protraction. But that would be a massive economic and military challenge for them to be able to sustain and maintain protracted conflict. So I think that contributes to deterrence as well. But you're right, there have been a lot of miscalculations throughout history.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Check out our membership program, War on the Rocks Platinum, at warontherocks.com/membership. If you want access to all sorts of really cool exclusive stuff that is growing all the time, we're working on some new members-only podcasts on the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Space Force, as well as one on AI. So sign up at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.